Sorry. All right. Sugar refining. Process of colonial raw material gave rise to new industries in England, providing further employment for shipping and contributed to a greater extension of the world market in an international trade. Of these raw materials, sugar was preeminent, and its manufacture gave birth to the sugar refining industry. The refining process transformed the crude brown sugar manufactured on the plantation onto white sugar, which was durable and capable of preservation.
Yep.
And could be easily handled and distributed all over the world. The easiest reference to sugar refining in England is the Order of the Privy Council of 1615, prohibiting aliens from erecting sugar houses or practicing the art of refining sugar. The importance of the industry increased in proportion to its production on the plantation, as sugar became, with the spread of tea and coffee, one of the necessities of life instead of the luxury of kings. About the middle of the 18th century, there were 120 refineries in England. Each refinery was estimated to provide employment for about 9 men. In addition, the distribution of the refined product called into existence a number of subsidiary trades and required ships and wagons for the coastal and inland trade. The sugar refining industry of Bristol was one of the most important of the kingdom. It was in Bristol in 1654 that the diarist Evelyn saw for first time the method of manufacturing loaf sugar. And in the annuals of the Bristol history, sugar figures frequently as a gift to distinguished visitors to the town, Richard, son of Oliver Cromwell, and King Charles II, in return for which the king knighted 4 of the town's merchants. In 1799, there were 20 refineries in Bristol. The town did more refining than London in proportion to size and population. Bristol's sugar was considered superior in quality and proximity to the coal supplies for fuel, enabling it to sell cheaper than London. While it found in Ireland, the whole of South Wales and West England, the markets for which it was disdained by its geographical location. Sugar refining long remained one of the staple for Bristol. The refiners of the city petitioned Parliament in 1789 against the abolition of the slave trade, on which, quote, the welfare and prosperity, if not the actual existence of the Caribbean islands, depend. In 1811, there were 16 refineries in the town, whose connections with this industry ceased only towards the end of the 19th century, when banana replaced sugar. Bananas. Some of Bristol's most prominent citizens were connected with the sugar refining business. Robert Addleworth, 17th century alderman, was closely identified with refining, while he was at the same time a merchant who built 2 docks to accommodate the increasing shipping. William Miles was the outstanding refiner of the 18th century. His career is typical of many other cases. Miles came to Bristol with 3 halfpence in his pocket, worked as a porter, apprenticed himself to a shipbuilder, saved £14, and sailed to Jamaica as a ship carpenter and a merchantman. He bought a cask or 2 of sugar, which he sold in Bristol at a huge profit, and with the proceeds bought articles in great demand in Jamaica and repeated his former investment. Miles soon became very wealthy and settled in Bristol as a refiner. This was the humble origins on one of the greatest fortunes made in the Caribbean trade. Taking his son into a new partnership, Miles was wealthy enough to give him a check of £100,000 to enable him to marry the daughter of aristocratic clergyman. The elder Miles became an alderman, and died rich and honored. The younger continued as the Caribbean merchant, dealing chiefly in sugar and slaves. I love you too. And at his death in 1848, left property valued at more than $1 million. In 1838, he was in possession of 663 slaves in Trinidad and Jamaica, for which he received compensation to the amount of £17,850. The frequent associated in Glasgow with tobacco industry is only a part of the truth. The prosperity of the town in the 18th century was due at least as much as to its sugar refining business. Sugar refining dated back to the second half of the 17th century. Hold on a second.
What? I just read it.
The West Sugar Houses was built in 1767, followed by the Easter in 1667 and 1669, and shortly after the South Sugar House, and another. Yet another followed in 1701, but Glasgow labored under the disadvantage that before 1707 direct trade relations with the colonies were illegal, and Glasgow sugar refiners were forced to depend on Bristol for their raw materials. By the Act of the Union and a happy accident, this unsatisfactory situation was brought to an end. Two Scotch officers, Colonel William Mark Delwall, cadet of the ancient family, and the Major James Milliken, while quartered in St. Neots, woed and won two heresies and widow, Tovey and her daughter, owners of great sugar plantations. The missing link had been found. The rival of the Harrises and his husbands meant that Glasgow became one of the leading ports of entry for the cargoes of Caribbean sugar. In the very year of the happy event of a new refinery was set up. The majority of the refiners were located in and around the capital, 80 compared with Bristol's 20. In 1774, there were 8 refineries in Liverpool, one of them the House of Brancackers, a firm also engaged in the slave trade, being one of the most extensive in the whole kingdom. There were others in Manchester, Chester, Lincolnshire, Whitehaven, Newcastle, Hull, Southampton, and Warrington. It may well be asked why the refining of the raw sugar was not done at the source of the plantation. The division of labor between agriculture and operations of the tropical climate and the industrial operations in the temperate climate has survived to this day. The original reason had nothing to do of the deliberate policies of the mother country. The ban on sugar refining in the islands corresponded to the ban on iron and textiles manufacturing on the mainland. Should they have refiners in England or the plantations? Asked Sir Thomas Clifford in 1671. Will 5 ships go for black people? Was his answer, and not above 2 if refined in the plantations. And so you destroy shipping and all that belongs to it. And if you lose this advantage to England, you lose all. Hence the heavy duty placed on refined sugar import into England 4 times as much as upon brown sugar. By this policy, England was called upon for the largest number of casks for the raw sugar, more coal and victuals. were consumed, and the national revenues increased. Dividends, pleas for permission for colonial refining fell on deaf ears. It is significant that a similar struggle was taking place in France, resulting in a similar victory for the mercantilists. Colbert had permitted the refining of sugar in the French Caribbean, and raw and refined sugar from the islands paid the same duty in France. But in 1682, the duty on refined sugar was doubled, while 2 years later, under penalty of fine of 3,000 leviers, it was forbidden to erect new refineries in the islands. A decree of 1698 was even more drastic. The duty on raw sugar from the Caribbean was lower from 4 to 3 livers per hundredweight, while the duty on refined sugar was increased for 8 to 22 of the half livers. Livres. Livries.
Papa, hi. I love you. Yeah. Hi.
She's like, pet me. Guess now you want to be petted? Now you want to be petted? This figure was the same duty charged to refined sugar from foreign lands. Quote, the drastic nature of the protections afforded the French refiners as against the compatriots in the colonies become apparent. The sugar refining interest of England was encouraged by such legislation. It did not always see eye to eye with the planting interests of whom it depended on supplies. Under the mercantile system, the sugar planters had a monopoly on the home market of the home market, and foreign imports were prohibited. It was therefore the policy of the planters to restrict production in order to maintain a high price. Their legal monopoly of the home market was a powerful weapon in their hands, and they used it mercilessly in the expenses of the whole population of England, while the price of sugar was being naturally forced down in the world market by the increase of sugar cultivation in the French, Spanish, and Portuguese colonies. The British planters were intent on maintaining a monopoly price in the home market. The friends of the planters warned them of the fatal and wretched error, and they were making for, quote, if the British plantation cannot or will not afford sugar, etc., plenty of cheap enough in French, Dutch, and Portuguese do and will. They were not wanting writers as early as 1730 who urged the government to, quote, open the, what's that word?
Sluices
of the law, and let in even the French sugar upon them until they would serve us at least as cheap as our neighbors are served. In 1739, Jamaica requested an assistance from the mother country. The Council of Trade and Plantation issues were clear and unmistakable warning. Jamaica had twice as much land as all the Leeward Islands combined, yet the exports of the Leeward Islands exceeded those of Jamaica. Quote, from whence it could naturally follow that not one half of our lands are at present cultivated, and that Great Basin does not reap
Great
Britain does not reap half the benefit of our colony, which she might do if it were fully settled. Planters would not listen. In the 18th century, they did not have to. The refiners of London and Westminster's, Southwark, Bristol protested to the Parliament in 1753 against the selfishness of the planters and the most intolerable kind of tax presented by the higher price of British sugar. The refiners urged Parliament to make it the interest of the sugar planters to produce more raw sugar by increasing the area under cultivation. They were carefully, however, not to pretend to, quote, set ourselves in competition with the inhabitants of all the sugar colonies, either for numbers, wealth, or consequence to the public. Parliament sidetracked the issue by passing resolutions about the encouragement of white settlers in Jamaica. Another crisis in relations between producers and processors developed between 1774 and
You missed the
1780.
line.
What?
You missed the line.
Okay. Another crisis in relations between producers and processors developed during the American Revolution. Imports of sugar declined by 1/3 between 1774 and 1780. Prices were high and the refiners were distressed, petitioned Parliament for relief in the form of the emissions of prize sugar. Reading between the lines of the evidence taken by the Parliamentary Committee on the subject, we see the conflict of interest between refiners and planters. High price benefited the planters, while the refiners wanted an increased supply, which the planters would not or could not give. If they would not make them, the refiners of Bristol recommended, quote, a sultry law, which would, quote, make it the interest of the British sugar colonies to extend the cultivations of their lands in order to enable them to raise a large produce and to send greater quantities of sugar to Great Britain, and thereby becoming more useful to their mother country, its trade and navigation and revenue. If they could not buy elsewhere, the French colonies, for example, quote, was I a refiner? Said one witness, a wholesale grocer. Should I certainly prefer San Domingo sugar or any other? The chasm was yawning at the feet of the sugar planters, but had held proudly in the air. He went his way, mumbling the lessons we had been taught by the mercantilist, in which he had learned, not wisely but too well. Rum distillation. What the hell is this? Okay, good. I didn't accidentally let you go. Get some water real quick.
Well, why we wait? Saint Domingo sugar, isn't that I think that's the yellow one with the word across the top. Actually, it's still made today.
I don't know. Rum distillation. Yet another colonial raw material gave birth to yet another English industry. One of the important byproducts of sugar is molasses, from which rum may be distilled. But rum never attained the importance of cotton, far less of sugar, as a contribution to British industry. Partly perhaps because much rum was imported directly from the islands in its finishing state. Imports from the islands increased from 58,000 gallons in 1721 to 320,000 in 1730. In 1763, the figure stood at 1.25 million gallons and was steadily over 2 million between 1765 and 1779. Rum was indispensable in the fisheries and in the fur trade and as a naval ration, but its connection with the triangular trade was more direct still. Rum was an essential part of the cargo of the slave ship, particularly the colonial American slave ships. No slave trader could afford to dispense with a cargo of rum. It was profitable to spread a taste for liquor on the coast. Black dealers were plied with it, were induced to drink till they lost their reason, and then the bargain was struck. One slave dealer was bagged full of the gold paid him for his slave, unintelligently accepted the slave's captain's invitation to dinner. He was made drunk and awoke the next morning and found his money gone, and himself stripped, branded, and enslaved with his own victims, to great mirths of the sailors. In 1765, 2 distilleries were established at Liverpool for the express purpose of supplying ships bound for Africa. Of the equal importance of the mercantilist was the fact that from molasses could be obtained in addition to rum, brandy, and low wines import from France. The distilleries were an important evidence of Bristol's interest in the sugar plantation, and many were jerrymaids, which they sent to Parliament in defense of their interests and in opposition to the importation of French brandies. Bishop Berkeley voiced the prevailing feelings when he asked acidly to strict mercantilist language. Quote, "Rather, if drunkenness be a necessary evil, men may not as well be drunk with the growth of their own country." The 18th century in England was notorious for its alcoholism. The popular drunk was gin, immortalized by Hogarth and his Gin Lane, a classic advertisement in gin shop in Southwark read, quote, "Drunk for a penny, dead drunk for 2 pence, clean straw for nothing," end quote. Gin and rum contended for pride and of place. The Caribbean planters argued that the rum was equal to 1/4 of the value of all that other products. To prohibit the sale of rum would therefore be to ruin them and drive the people to foreign substitutes. The planters expressed the hope that the suppression of the evil occasioned by the excessive use of spirituous liquor would not entail the destruction of the sugar trade. As they saw it, the question was not whether people would drink, but what they should drink. Gin, argued an anonymous writer, was, quote, "vastly more destructive to human fame than rum. Gin is a spirit, acrid, and inflaming for inward use, but rum is a spirit so mild, balsamic, and benign of it that if it's properly used and tempered, it may be made highly useful both for the relief and regalement of human nature." This was a strange description of the spirit which the barbarians more appropriately nicknamed Kill Devil. Barbonians. The people from Barbados. My bad, I thought there was Barbadians. My bad. Appropriately nicknamed Kill Devil. Against the planters, it was contended that the Caribbean rum trade was too unimportant to permit the continuance of a glaring enormity, which extended to destroy the health and morals of the people of Great Britain. It is not unlikely that other considerations were involved. Rum competed with spirits made from corn. The Caribbean interest was therefore at odds with the English agriculture interest. The sugar planters charged that distilling from corn tended to raise the price of bread. This concern for the poor consumer of bread was touching, coming as it did for extortionists who wanted the poor to spend more money on their sugar and it's inundated by 100 years a similar but more significant conflict between English farmers and English industrialists over cheaper bread or lower wages for the working classes. Molasses embittered the relationship between Caribbean sugar planter and English landlords, as it embittered relations between planters and mainland colonists. And the Caribbean interest was always quick to recommend its substitution in England whenever there was a grain shortage, they said, but in reality, whenever there was a glut of sugar, quote Sweet Gentleman, wrote an anonymous champion of the counties in 1807, quote, "They have sought a very, very far-fetched argument in support of their saccharine cause."
Saccharine.
Thank you. The Michael Sadler in 1831 opposed the idea. A wholesome beverage might be made from the article, but the people of England did not like it. The real enemy, however, of the Caribbean distillers was not the English farmer, but the English distiller. The New England trader refused to purchase Caribbean rum and insisted on molasses which they themselves distilled and sent to Newfoundland. The indigenous tribes, and above all Africa, the rum trade on the slave coast became a vital monopoly of New England. In 1770, New England exports of rum to Africa represented over 4/5 of the total colonial exports of that year. And yet, another important vested interest drew its subsistence from the triangular trade. But here, to lay the seed of future disruptions, French Caribbean molasses was cheaper than British because French distilling was not permitted to compete with the brandies of the home country. Rather than feed their molasses to their horses, they preferred to sell it to the mainland colonists, yeah, and later, therefore, turned to the French planters, and molasses was one of the principal items in that trade between mainland and the foreign sugar colonies, which, as the sequel showed, had far-reaching consequences for the British sugar planters. Pocatile, we're gonna look up what that means.
While you look that up, I was thinking in this case, colonists and colonialists, same thing.
Yeah, but we want to say the right word.
Yeah, we do, but I was just making a joke.
Oh, I didn't get it. Sorry. What are you? Cheap goods, junk, and trumpery. A French noun that means, okay. It refers to a famous Senegalese political rapper. Okay. All right, so we're going to find out what this is. Slave cargoes were incomplete without the pocatile, the subsidiary item of
Sundry.
What?
It's sundry, the sundry items.
Thank you. Sundry items of gewgaws, which appeal to the Africans' love for bright colors, and for which after having sold their follows, they would late in the 19th century part with their land and grant mining concessions. Articles of glass and beads were always in demand on the slave coast and on the plantations where there was a great demand for bottles. Most of these articles were manufactured in Bristol. One slave dealer received a fine black person from a prince in return for 13 beads of coral, half a string of amber, 28 silver bells, and 3 pairs of bracelets for his women. In acknowledgement of this liberality, gotta hear that. Liberality. Okay, good. Liberality he presented to the prince favorite a present of some rows of glass beads and about 4 ounces of scarlet wool. Individually, these items were of negligible value. In the aggregate, they constituted a trade of great importance, so essential to the part of the slave transactions of the word pocatile is still commonly used in the Caribbean. today to denote a cheap and towdry babble given as compensation for objects of great value. The metallurgical industries. Hello. Might not have coins, so wish you luck. Slave trading demanding goods more gruesome, through not a whit less useful than wooden and cotton manufacturing. Fetters and chains and padlocks were needed to fasten black people more securely on the slave ships, and thus prevented both mutiny and self-unaliving. The practice of branding the slaves to identify them required red-hot irons. Legal regulations prescribed that on any ship designed for Africa, the Caribbeans, or the East and West Indies, but for 3/4 of their proportions of beer was to be put in iron-bound casks, hooped with iron hoops, and good substance and well-wrought iron. Iron bars were the trading minimum on the large part of the African coast, were equivalent to 4 copper bars. Iron bars constituted nearly 3/4 of the value of the cargo of the Swallow in 1679, nearly 1/4 of the cargo of the Mary in 1690, nearly 1/5 of a slave cargo in 1733. In 1682, the Royal African Company was exporting about 10,000 bars of iron a year. The iron masters, too, found a useful market in Africa. Guns formed a regular part of every African cargo. Birmingham became the center of gun trade, as Manchester was of the cotton trade. The struggle between Brigham and London over the gun trade was merely another angle to the struggle for free trade or monopoly, which we have already noticed for the slave trade in general between the capital and the outports. In 1709 and 1710, the gun makers of London petitioned in favor of the Royal African Company's monopoly. And Brigham, gun makers and iron makers threw their weight and influence against the company and the London interest. 3 times in 1709, 1708, 1709, and 1711, they petitioned against the renewal of the company's monopoly, which had been modified in 1698. Their trade had increased since then, and they feared a renewal of the monopoly which would subject their manufacturers, quote, to one buyer or to any monopolizing society exclusive of all others. In the 19th century, Brigham guns were exchanged for African palm oil, but the 18th century saw less innocent exchange. The Birmingham guns of the 18th century were exchanged for men, and it was a common saying that the price of a black person was one Birmingham gun. The African musket was an important Birmingham export, reaching a total of 100,000 to 150,000 annually. With the British government and the East Indian, but we're Caribbeans, but it's not the West part, it's the East. Company Africa ranked it as the most important consumer in the Birmingham gun maker. Go ahead.
East India is just India.
Okay. The need of the plantations too were not to be dispensed. In the late 17th century, the ironmasters Stitwell and Derbyshire were producing among their items sugar stoves and rollers for crushing cane in Barbados, and Birmingham too was interested in the plantations. Exports of wrought iron and nails went to the plantations, though these exports intended to fluctuate according to the conditions of the sugar trade. As one ironmaster said in 1737, the bad state of some of our sugar islands has been some prejudice to the iron trade for the consumption of iron, where in those islands is more or less, as their trade for sugar is better or worse. The old historian of the city has left us a picture in Birmingham's interest in the colonial system, axes for India, tomahawks for the natives of North America, and to Cuba and Brazil chains, handcuffs, and iron collars for the poor slaves. In the primeval forest of America, the Birmingham Act struck down the old trees. The cattle pastures of Australia rang with the sound of Birmingham bells. In East India, the West, they tended the fields of sugar cane with Birmingham hoes. Along with iron went brass, copper, and lead. The exports of brass pans and kettles to Africa dated back before 1660, but increased with free trade after the 1698. Thereafter, Birmingham began to export large quantities of cutlery and brass goods, and throughout the 18th century, British goods effectively sustained competition with foreign and colonial markets. The Chadali Company founded the North Staffordshire in 1719, soon became one of the leading brass and copper concerns in England. It extended the scope of its operation to include the brass wire, the guinea rods, and the menelaces, the metal rings worn by the African tribes, used in the African trade. The company's capital increased 11 times between 1734 and 1780, when the company was reorganized, started from small beginnings. It became one of the most important, if not the most important, of the brass and copper concerns of the 18th century. According to the traditions, ships sailed to Africa with the holds full of idols and menelaces, while the cabins were occupied by missionaries. An edifying example of the material good in competition with the immaterial ones. The Baptist mills of Bristol produced the prodigious quantity of brass with which, drawn into wire and formed into battery, was exclusively used in the African trade. The Holywell Works, in addition to producing copper sheathings for the Liverpool ships, manufactured brass pans for the Caribbean sugar and East India tea merchants, and all varieties of cheap and gaudy brass instruments for the African trade. Brass pans and kettles were exported to Africa and the plantation. And in one list, after the heading, brass pans, we read, ditto large to wash their bodies in. These bath pans, made now by galvanized tin, are still a normal feature of Caribbean indigenous life today. The needs of shipbuilding gave a further stimulus to heavy industry. The iron chain of anchored foundries, of which there were many in Liverpool, lived off the building of ships. Copper sheathing for the vessels gave rise to local industries in the town's adjacent districts to supply the demand. Between 30 to 40 vessels were employed in transporting the copper, smelted in Lancashire and Cheshire for the works at Holywell, to the warehouses in Liverpool. The ironmaster's interest in the slave trade continued throughout the century. When the question of abolition came before the Parliament, the manufacturers and the dealers in iron, copper, brass, and lead in Liverpool petitioned against the project, which would affect employment in the town and send 4,000 as solitary wanderers into the world to seek employment in foreign claims. This in the same year, Birmingham declared that it was dependent on the slave trade to a considerable extent for a large part of its various manufacturers. Abolition would ruin the town and impoverish many of its inhabitants. This apprehension were exaggerated. The munitions demanded for the commercial wars of the 18th century had prepared the ironmasters for the still greater demands to come during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. The colonial markets, moreover, were inadequate to absorb the increasing production, which resulted from the technological innovations. Between 1710 and 1735, iron exports almost tripled. In 1710, the British Caribbean islands took over 1/5 of the exports. In 1735, less than 1/6. In 1710, over 1/3 of the exports to plantations went to the sugar islands. In 1735, over 1/4. The peak was reached in 1729, when the Caribbeans took nearly 1/4 of the total exports and nearly 1/2 of the exports to all the plantations. Expansion at home, contractions in the sugar islands. In 1783, the ironmasters, too, were beginning to look the other way. By Cinderella decked out temporarily in her fancy clothes, was enjoying herself too much at the ball to pay any attention to the hands of the clock. That's the end of that chapter. Any questions? Any questions? I don't know who Dream Miley, whatever his name is.
I don't know either, but I don't have any questions.
Drimlight. It's Drimlight. I guess it's Drimlight. Chapter 4. The Caribbean Interest. Our tobacco colonies, wrote Adam Smith, send us home so no much wealthy planters, as we see frequently arrive from our sugar islands. The sugar planters ranked among the biggest capitalists of the mercantilist epoch. A very popular play, The Caribbean, was produced in London in 1771. It opens with a tremendous reception, being prepared for the planter coming to England, as if it were the Lord Mayor who was expected. The servants philosophized, quote, "He's very rich, and that's sufficient. They say he has rum and sugar, enough belonging to him to make all the water in the Thames into punch." The Caribbean planters was a familiar figure in the English society in the 18th century. The plantation lies in the absence of landlordism, which has always been the curse of the Caribbean and is still one of its major problems today. The absentee planters once argued that, quote, "The climate of our sugar colonies is no inconvenience for an English constitution, that no man will choose to live there, would choose to live there, much less will any man choose to settle there, without the hopes at least of supporting his family in a more handsome manner, or saving more money than he can do by any business he can expect in England, or in our plantations upon the continent of America. But the Caribbean climate is not disagreeable, and his fortunes once made, the slave owner returned to Britain. Writing in 1689, the agent of Barbados stated that, quote, "By a kind of magnetic force, England draws to it all that is good in the plantation. It is the center to which all things tend. Nothing but England can be relish or fancy. Our hearts are here, wherever our bodies be. All that we can wrap and rend is brought to England." In 1698, the Caribbean were sending back annually to England with about 300 children to be educated, the difference being, according to Devenant, that the fathers went out poor and the children came back rich. "Well," said Mr. Belcour, the planter in the comedy, quote, "The Caribbean indigenous." Sorry, it's saying the I word when I'm saying indigenous. "For the first time in my life, here am I in England, that the fountain head be pleasure in the land of beauty, of art and elegancies. My happy stars have given me a good estate, and the conspiring winds have blown me hither to spend it. Returning to England, the planter's foulest wishes was to acquire an estate, blend with the aristocracy, and remove the marks of their origins. Their presence in England, as Boroham pointed out, had a frequently how do you say that word? Deleterious?
Deleterious? I'm not quite sure.
All right. Is it deleterious? Watch it be deleterious. Not a lot of people in here. People don't like readings, do they? They want to go and like, let's go debate. Deleterious, causing harm or damage, often in a way that is slow, subtle. Deleterious effect on English character and morals. Where they were numerously and had acquired land, they commonly introduced a bad state of manners into the locality. Their colossal wealth permitted lavish expenditures, which smacked in vulgarity and excited in the envy of and disapproval of the less opulent English aristocracy. The political economist Merivale, later in the 19th century, argued that the change from residence to absenteeism was a credit rather than a disgrace to English character, as it evincing a distaste for the cheap-rooted hard-heartedness and legacy of life in the slave colonies, but the peculiar, oh my gosh, fastidiousness which shrank from the contact with slavery, whilst it had no objection to enjoy the profits of slavery. Merivale could explain only by, quote, the general apology of the inconsistency of human nature. Absenteeism, however, had serious consequences in the islands. Plantations were left to be mismanaged by overseers and attorneys. On occasions, governors found it difficult to obtain a quorum for the council. Many offices were held by a single individuals, and the disproportionate between white and black populations was increased, aggravating the dangers of slave rebellions. The deficiency laws failed to restrain the practice of absenteeism, so the local assemblies tried to confiscate the large tracts of land lying idle and owning by absentees, and proposed their redivision among small farmers. Both measures were opposed by the British government at the insistence of the absentee planters. Of the sugar planters residents in England, the most prominent were the Beckfords, an old, oh my gosh, Gloucestershire family dated back to the 12th century. One died fighting for his king on Bosworth Field in 1483. Another found in the English conquest of Jamaica a means of retrieving the family fortunes. In 1670, Alderman Sir Thomas Beckford, one of the first absentee proprietors, was getting £2,000 per annum from his Jamaican property, clear of all charges. Peter Bedford became the most distinguished of the new colonists. He held in the course of time all the most important military and civil positions in the island, became president of the councils and later lieutenant governor and commander-in-chief. At his death in 1710, he, quote, was in possession of the largest property, real and personal, and any subject in Europe. In 1737, his grandson, William, inherited the family wealth and became the most powerful Caribbean planter in England. Bedford, on his Wiltshire estate, built Fonthills mansion, long regarded as the most attractive and splendid seat of the west of England. It was a handsome, uniformed edifice consisting of a center of 4 stories and 2 wings of 2 stories connected by corridors built to fine stone and adorned with the bold portico resting on a rustic basement with 2 sweeping flights of steps. Its apartments were numerous and splendidly furnished. They displayed the rich and luxury of the East, and on particular occasions were superbly brilliant and dazzling, whilst its walls were adorned with the most costly works of art. Its sideboards and cabinets presented a gorgeous combination of gold, silver, and precious metals. The precarious stones arranged and worked by the most tasteful artists and artisans added to these splendors. These dazzling objects, apparently augmented and multiplied by large, costly mirrors, was a vast choice and valuable library. Some idea may be formed of the extent, etc., of the house by the measurement of its great entrance hall in the basement story, which was 85 feet 10 inches in length by 38 feet by 38 feet 6 inches in breadth. Its roof was vaulted and supported it by large stone piers. One apartment was fitted up in the Turkish style, with large mirrors, ottomans, etc., whilst others were enriched with fine sepulchres, marble chimneys pieces. Beckford Jr. was not to be outdone, possessed of a vivid fancy and a vast fortune which, according to the family historian, could not be satisfied by anything commonplace. He desired novelty, grandeur, complexity, and even sublimity. The result for Fonthill Abbey, the construction of which provided employment for a vast number of mechanics and laborers, even a new village being built to accommodate some of the settlers. Abbey's ground were in one section planted with every species of American flowering shrub and tree growing in all their native wildness. In 1837, Beckford was awarded £15,160 by way of compensation for 770 slaves he owned in Jamaica. The Hibberts were Caribbean planters as well as merchants, who, as we have seen, supplied cotton and linen, checks for Africa and the plantations. Robert Hibbert lived in Bedfordshire off the income from his Caribbean property. His plantations was one of the finest in Jamaica, though he was always an intimately kind master. His biographer assured us, good for him, he had no repugnance to this kind of property or on morale grounds. On his death, he left in trust a fund yielding about £1,000 per annum for 3 or more divinity and scholarships to encourage the spread of Christianity in its simplest and most intelligent form and the unfettered exercise of private judgment in the matter of religion. What a dick. A relative, George, was partner in the opulent trading firm in London. It was for many years agent of Jamaica in England. George Hibbert took the lead in the construction of the Caribbean docks. He was elected first chairman on the board of directors, and today his portrait, printed by Lawrence, hangs in the boardroom of the Port of London Authority. A great collector of books, the sales of his library lasted 42 days. The Hilberts received £31,120 in compensations for their 1,618 slaves. The family mansion in Kingston, one of the oldest houses in Jamaica, still stands today, while the family name is perpetuated in the Hibbett Journal, the celebrated quarterly journal devoted to religion, theology, and philosophy, first published in October 1902. The journal had, quote, the sanction and support of the Hilbert trustees, whoever disclaimed responsibility for the opinions expressed in this page. Such a benevolent, good slave owner. Shut the fuck up. Also connected with Jamaica were the Longs. Charles Longs, at his death, left property in Suffolk, a house of Bloomsbury, London. The total property in Jamaica comprised of 14,000 acres. He enjoyed a very large income, by far the largest of any Jamaican proprietor of that period, and was accordingly entitled to live in splendor. His grandson, a Jamaican planter, wrote a well-known history of the island. A relative, Beston Long, Jr., was chairman of the London Dock Company and a bank director in his family mansion in Bishopgate Street, London, was justly famous. Another member of the family, Ford Vandenborg, built Bromley Hill Palace in Kent, one of the most famous mansions of England, noted for its wonderful ornamental garden. Not content with his partnership in the Liverpool business house of Corey and Company, engaged in the grain trade, John Gladstone was indirectly concerned in the slave traffic as a slave owner in the Caribbean. Quote, like many more merchants of reputed probity and honesty, he was able to satisfy his conscience by arguing it to be a necessity. Gladstone, through foreclosures, acquired large plantations in British Guiana and Jamaica, while at the same time he was extensively engaged in the Caribbean trade. The sugar and other produce, which he sold on the Liverpool Exchange, were grown on his own plantation and imported in his own ships. The fortune amassed by this means permitted him to open up trade connections in Russia, India, and China, and to make large and fortunate investments in the land and house property in Liverpool. He contributed largely to the charities of Liverpool, built the endowed churches, and was an eloquent champion in the town of the Greeks in their struggle for independence, when his famous son William Ilhart was electioneering in Newark in 1832. A public journal accurately, if not in good taste, reminded the electors that the candidate was, quote, the son of Gladstone of Liverpool, a person who had amassed a large fortune by Caribbean dealings. In other words, a great part of his gold was sprung from the blood of black slaves. During the greater part of the agitation for emancipation, John Gladstone was chairman of the Caribbean associations. On one occasion, conducted a memorable controversy in one of the Liverpool journals with James Carper, a Liverpool abolitionist, on the question of Caribbean slavery. The compensation paid to Gladstone in 1837, in accordance with the Act of 1833, amounted to £85,600 for 2,183 slaves. That's fucking ridiculous. What a little... Well, never mind. The Cordrentons were another well-known family which owed its wealth and status to its slaves and sugar plantation. Christopher Cordrenton was governor of Barbados during the 17th century, and his plantations in Barbados and Bermuda were worth £100,000 in modern money. He found a college there which still bears his name, and on his death left £10,000, most of it for a library, and his valuable collections of books worth £6,000 to All Souls College, Oxford. where they formed a nucleus of the family's Cordorinton library. One of his descendants was hero of the naval victory in Navarino in the cause of Greek independence in the 19th century. The Warner family was dispersed over the Leeward Islands, some in Antigua, some in Dominica, some in St. Vincent, some in Trinidad. Thompson Warner was a pioneer among the British colonialists in the Caribbean. Joseph, one of the family, rose to be one of the 3 leading surgeons in his day, surgeon at Guy's Hospital, and first member of the College of Surgeons founded in 1750. Is pictured by Samuel Medley, is in the possession of the Royal College of Surgeons. In the 19th century, another Warren was president of the Council of Antigua, while yet another as Attorney General in Trinidad, as the great advocate of East Indian immigration. Perhaps the best known of the Caribbean family was Pelham Warner, famous English cricketer and acknowledged authority on the great English game. Other names less spectacular recall the glories that was Sugar. Byron Edwards, historian of the British Caribbean at the end of the 18th century, would, by his own confession, have lived and died in oblivion on the small patronal estate in the decayed town of Westbury in Wiltshire. But for his 2 opulent uncles engaged in sugar cultivation in the Caribbean, the Pennies, well known in Bristol's own sugar plantation in Nevis. Joseph Marryatt's son was Captain Frederick Marryat, a famous novelist of sea life and the inventor of a code of signals for the merchant marines, not abandoned until 1857. Colonel William McDowell was the most notable figure in Glasgow, quote, owner of a noble mansion in the country and a rich estate in the Caribbean, with ships on the sea and cargo of sugar and rum constantly coming home. He had also a social prestige of his army rank and his long family descent, and must have held the regard of everyone as he stepped with his tall, gold-headed cane along the causeway. Byron Edwards indignantly denied the charge that his fellow planters were remarkable for gigantic opulence or an ostentatious display of it. The unavailable evidence points to the contrary. The wealth of the Caribbean indigenous became proverbial. Communities of opulent Caribbeans were to be found in London and Bristol. The memorials on plaques of All Saints Church, Southampton, speaks eloquently of the social positions they once employed. The public schools of Eton, Westminster, Harrow, and Westchester were full of the sons of Caribbeans. The carriages of the planters were so numerous that when they gathered, Londoners complained that the streets were for some distance blocked. The stories is told of how on the visits of Weymouth, George III, and Pitt encountered a wealthy Jamaican with an imposing equipage. I don't know what that word is.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know that word particular, but I think it's interesting that they keep calling themselves or getting called Jamaicans or Caribbeans when these are white people from Europe. These are European colonizers.
Equipage, a set of equipment, geared, or supplies. Including outriders and livery, George III, much displeased, is reported to have said, quote, sugar, eh? All that sugar. How are the duties, eh? Pitt, how are the duties? I don't understand what they say. West indigenous Caribbean planters were familiar visitors at the resort of Epsom and, oh my gosh, Cheltenham. Their children mingled in terms of equality with the elegant throngs at the assembly rooms and the Holt Wells of Bristol. The Caribbean Harris
Heirs.
was the desirable plum of Charles James Fox. Almost decided that the £80,000 fortune of Miss Phipps was the solution to his heavy gambling debts. One might speculate on what effect such a marriage would have had on Fox's career as an abolitionist. Many a humble individual in England rose to wealth and influence from some chance legacy of the indigenous Caribbean plantations. The time came when such a legacy was considered gale and wormwood, but it was not so in the 18th century. George Coleman's plays Africans portray in youth Mr. Marrowbone, the butcher, a situation that must have been very familiar to the audience. The butcher was left in Caribbean plantation and now barters for black people instead of bargaining for bullocks. The strength of the planters was increased, too, by the large numbers of Caribbean merchants who drew vast profits from the Caribbean trade. According to Professors Namer, there were comparatively few big merchants in Great Britain in 1761 who in one connection or another did not trade with the Caribbean, and a considerable number of gentry families had interests in the Sugar Islands, just as vast numbers of Englishmen who hold shares in Asiatic rubbers or tea plantations or oil fields. The two groups did not always see eye to eye. On the outset, planters and merchants represented distinct organizations, and the bound between them, credit, did not always make for harmony. But this in itself would not have been a basic cause for conflict, as the merchants could always have recourse to foreclosure. More important than the factor of debt was the planters' determination to maintain monopoly prices, and in the struggle for the grant of direct trade to Europe. In 1739, ill feeling between the two groups increased considerably, but by and large, the identity of interest was greater and more important than the clash, and planters and merchants finally coalesced about 1780, when all the strength they could jointly muster was soon to be needed to strengthen the dikes of monopoly against the gathering torrent of free trade. The combination of these two forces, planters and merchants, coupled with colonial agents in England, constituted a power and Caribbean interest of the 18th century. The classic age of parliamentary corruption and electoral venality, where their money talked. They bought votes, rotted boroughs, and so got into Parliament. Their competition forced up the price of seats. The Earl of Chesterfield was laughed to scorn in 1767 when he offered £2,500 for a seat for which a Caribbean should offer double. No private hereditary English fortune could resist this torrent of colonial gold and corruption. The English landed aristocracy were indignant, vexed, put to great expenses, and even baffled by the Caribbean at elections. There is an unmistakable note of this concern in the warning issued by Cumberland in his drama to the Caribbean obstinations. I can't say this damn word.
Ostentatiously.
Flaunting his wealth and boasting of his plans of spending it, to use it, not to waste it. I should hope to treat it, Mr. Blancourt, no, not as a vessel over whom you have wanted and dystopic power, but as a subject which you are bound to govern with a temperate and restrained authority. In the election of 1830, a Caribbean planter successfully spent £18,000 getting himself elected in Bristol. The election expenses of the unsuccessful Caribbean candidate in Liverpool in the same year cost nearly £50,000, of which a rich Caribbean merchant, slave trader, and slave owner, John Bolton, supplied 1/5. The Beckford dynasty was fittily represented in Parliament in accordance with its wealth. King William was MP for Staffensbury's from 1747 to 1754, and for the metropoles from 1754 to 1770. Another brother represented Bristol and third Salisbury, while a fourth was intended for the Westshire borough. Richard Pignat was one time represented Liverpool. One of the Corringtons was a member of Parliament in 1737. Gilbert Hilbert presented Seaford from 1806 to 1812. Edward Colston, the Cunard of the 17th century, sat for Bristol from 1710 to 1713. The Caribbean interest established a monopoly in all but name of one Bristol seat. John Gladstone sat first for Woodstock, and then for Lancaster, and it was his pleasure to listen in May 1833 to the maiden speech of his son, and P for Newark, in defense of slavery on the family estate in Guyana. The first statements found all his filial feelings involved in the question of slavery, and his family connection with the Caribbean. Sugar plantations brought out all his eloquence. One of the Lacases sat in Parliament in 1757. To the bitter end, Henry Goulburn fought the Caribbean battle. In 1833, he was still asking Parliament to mark the impulsive given to trade and agriculture, and to look at the helmets that had sprung into towns in consequence of the connection with the colonies. Parliament paid no heed to Goulburn, had to be content with nearly 5,000 compensation for his 242 slaves. Joseph Marot of Trinidad, Henry Bright of Bristol, Keith Douglas, Charles Ellis, all were Caribbean. 10 out of 15 members of one of the most important committees of the Society of Planters and Merchants held seats in English Parliament. To make assurances doubly sure, the Caribbean, like the slave traders, were entrenched not only in the lower house but also in the House of Lords, to defend their plantations and social structures on which they rested. Passage from one house to another was easy. Peerages were readily conferred in return for political support. There are few, if any, noble houses in England, according to the modern writers, without the Caribbean strain. Richard Pinnett became Lord Byron. The Lescastle, I can't say his name, an old Barbadian family were ennobled and became Herewoods. One of their descendants is at present married to the sister of the reigning King of England. The Marquess of Chados, sponsored of the Chados Clause and the Reform Bill of 1832, owned Caribbean plantation, was a spokesman of the Caribbean interest, though he lived to see the day when it was almost hopeless to advocate the cause of the Caribbean. The Earl of Belcaris processed sugar plantation in Jamaica. Emancipation found him owner of 640 slaves, from whom he received nearly 12,300 pounds compensation. This explains his hysterical opposition as governor of the island to the convention made by General Maitland with the slave leader Toussaint Louverture for the evacuation of San Domingo. After Britain's abortive efforts to conquer the French colonies, it would be brought somewhat odd, he wrote home, if the city of London should send over a immense quantity of provisions and clothing for the use of San Colletti armed assembled for the purpose of invading England. Lord Hawkesbury and Jenkins was a Caribbean proprietor and is president of the Privy Council for Trade. He lent consistent support to the cause of slave owners and slave traders. Hold on a second. 106.
Okay, we're going to do one of this. But I would like to ask, isn't privy another word for toilet? Anyways, that's one of my questions. The other one is,
I don't know. To answer your first question, I don't know.
okay, I swear privy is another word for toilet. Anyways, someone came in and said, don't worry, the proto-commie societies had slavery too. I did ask them to name a commie society and they left.
Who cares? Who cares? They're just there to distract and be assholes and rage bait. For the devotion tracts in favor of the slave trade were dedicated to him. The Liverpool conferred on him the freedom of the city in gratitude for the essential services rendered to the town of his exertion in Parliament in support of the slave trade. Hawkesbury symbolized the connection by assuming the title of Earl in Liverpool when raised to the peerage and acceptance of or cooperation offered to quarter its arms with his own. It was not only the mother of parliaments that the slave owners dominated. Like their allies, the sugar merchants and slave traders were in evidence everywhere as aldermen, mayor, and counselors. William Beckford was alderman of the city of London and twice Lord Mayor. Contemporaries laughed at his faulty Latin and loud voice. They were forced to respect his wealth, positions, and political influence. As mayor, his civic entertainments were magnificent. On one occasion, at the sumptuous banquet, 6 dukes to marquises,
Marquis.
23 earls, 4 viscounts, 14 barons of the upper house joined the members of the commons and went in procession to the city to honor him. He remains famous, this for his defense of Wilkie's, the liberty of speech, indifferent to royal displeasure. The London guild halls were standing in splendid monuments erected in his honor, with the famous speech graven in letters of gold on the pedestal which made George III blush. His brother Richard was also a alderman in the city of London. William Miles lived to become an alderman in Bristol. George Hibbert became alderman in London. The Caribbean interests had powerful friends. Chatham was consistent defender of Caribbean claims, right or wrong, and was a close friend of Beckford. He should ever consider the sugar colonies as a landed interest in this kingdom, and it was barbarism to consider them otherwise. John Gilderston and John Bolton were various supporters of Canning, who always harped on the fearfulness and delicacy and the most awful importance of the Caribbean question. Hawkinson and Wellington were very cordially dispossessed to the planters and later refused to plunder the proprietors in the Caribbean in order to acquire for themselves a little popularity in England. The former considered for considering emancipation attainable by legislative interposition in salutary enactments. But the recalcitrance
Recalcitrant.
of the planters and their willful refusal to make concessions to the anti-slavery segment of England later alienated these friends. Canning found Caribbean slavery an unpalatable topic. Slave questions nearly drove Hawkinson wild, and the planters seemed to him wild. Wellington, before the final word was said on British slavery, subjected a Caribbean deputation of London to some rough treatment. I'm done. I can't read anymore. I'm done. I'm starting to falter. So we start at 107. Stopping at 107.
107.
Oh my God. Maybe I need to do it. No, wait. I need to do one more. Never mind. I'm not stopping at 107. I have one last. Okay. Allied with the other monopolists in 18th century, the landed aristocracy and the commercial bourgeoisie of the seaport towns, this powerful Caribbean interest exerted in the reformed parliaments an influence sufficient to make every statesman pause and represent a solid phalanx of whose support in emergencies have administrations in turn has experienced the value. They put up a determined resistance of abolition, emancipation, and abrogation of their monopoly. They were always on the warpath to oppose an increase of the duties on sugar, which Beckford was once described as a coup de grace of our sugar colonies and sugar trade. The Caribbean interest was the infant terrible of English politics until American independence struck the first great blow of mercantilism and monopoly. In 1885, the governor of Jamaica protested at any additional duty proposed on sugar, with discouraged planting, throw new plantations out of cultivations, and prevented the enlargement of others. By proposal, Virginia received the mortal stab, Barbados and the island fall into the heretic fever, and Jamaica into a consumption. In 1744, the planters sent their case to every member of Parliament in an attempt to encourage popular clamor against another proposal to increase the sugar duties. The proposal was carried by the majority of 23, nor was the smallness of it a matter of surprise to those who considered how many were either by themselves or their friends deeply concerned in one part or another of the sugar trade, that the cause itself was always popular in the House of Commons. The West indigenous, however, succeeded in transferring the extra duty proposed on sugar to foreign linens. The whole episode merely illustrates the difficulties which attended the laying and further duty upon sugar from the number of influences of those concerned, directly or indirectly, in that extensive branch of trade. The issue came up again when it was necessary to finance the 7-Year War. The landed aristocrats of England was usually supported of his brother in the colonies, but then it came to choosing between himself and his distant relative. He took the view that his shirt was near him, but his skin was nearer. Beckford, in defiance of his fellows, was interrupted by his horse laughing every time he uttered the word sugar. The magic finger was writing. The agent of Massachusetts reported in 1764 that there were 50 or 60 indigenous voters, Caribbean voters, who would turn the balance of any side they pleased. It was the heyday of the power of the Caribbean sugar interest. But in the new century and in the reformed parliament, there appeared another combination of 50 or 60 voters. It was Lancashire's cotton interest Its slogan was not monopoly, but laissez-faire. And we'll end there at 108, Chapter 5, British Industry and the Triangular Trade.
So, I just wanted to say, like, I know we agreed not to correct the names, but at the same time, I was thinking, I'm not correcting their names. They don't deserve to have their name right.
Okay. Interesting. Oh, well, that was interesting. That was good. I enjoyed that reading. Who's in here? No one. Well, Lynn's the viewer. And it's just you, me, and Lynn. And
Yeah,
Yusuf.
I had to block a few people.
Yeah. All right, well, I'm going to close it out. All right, I'll talk to y'all later.